Move over, Xevious and Heian-kyo Alien. There's a new pillar of game design in town. It's NES Works Gaiden, episode 38.
Your favorite fire-breathing monster is back, like you've never seen him before.
To wash away the stink of last episode's arcade-to-Famicom conversions, we have one that, as the kids today say, slaps.
Well, okay, most people will find the Tower of Druaga to be something of an acquired taste, but back in the day, this Famicom cartridge captured plenty of hearts and minds. The earliest days of Famicom releases look a lot like the earliest days of the NES. More than 2/3 of the games published in Japan during the Famicom's first 2 years made their way to the West. As I've mentioned before, that won't be the case going forward. The Japanese library will look increasingly unfamiliar to Americans and Europeans. The conventional wisdom these days suggests that we didn't miss out on much because most of those unlocalized games were pretty wretched, and that opinion is not entirely wrong. Of course, we made up for it here with no end of absolutely dog-awful NES exclusive releases that flooded the system in its later years. However, the differences between the Famicom and NES experience run much deeper than just which extremely terrible games shipped in each of their respective regions. You'll find an even more accurate representation of each console's life by looking to the games that hit big in each territory. What did Japanese gamers love that Americans didn't, and vice versa? Why has Nintendo always treated things like Punch-Out and Metroid as something of an afterthought despite their massive sales on NES? Because Nintendo centers its work on the tastes of its Japanese audience first and foremost, and those games barely blipped on the radar back then. In fact, I bought a new, sealed copy of Metroid for Disk System for about $50 a few years ago, because entire cases of new old stock were still cluttering Japanese stockrooms more than 30 years after the game's debut. Likewise, the affection that Japanese publishers lavish upon seemingly irrelevant games like Xevious and Spelunker may seem bewildering to Westerners who don't realize just how well those games sold overseas. Compare a fan-driven retrospective best-of ranking for Famicom to one for NES, and you'll end up with an almost completely different set of games. Namcot's The Tower of Druaga is one of the first major points of divergence between the NES and Famicom experience. To this point, I think it's safe to say that the Famicom's biggest and most beloved hits eventually made their way west, but The Tower of Druaga leapt to the top of the Famicom sales charts while remaining completely unknown in the West for another decade. Although some online sources do suggest that Druaga made its way to the US in arcades back in the day, just as many suggest otherwise. I think it's safe to say that Druaga had no real visibility in America or Europe until it showed up on Namco Museum Volume 3 for PlayStation, where it was greeted with either mild puzzlement or scornful disinterest by this new audience. Back in its home territory, however, Druaga was greeted with eager warmth both in arcades and on Famicom. The action role-playing genre had just begun to explode in popularity around the time Druaga hit arcades in 1984. It arrived in game centers across Japan just a few months before Falcom's breakout hit Dragon Slayer debuted on personal computers, followed soon after by TNE Soft's Hydlide. Clearly, there was something in the water. In any case, Druaga gave young gaming fanatics a stripped-down, coin-op-friendly taste of a game format simultaneously taking root on personal computers, making it a great introduction to the genre. Not to mention a great substitute for kids whose families couldn't necessarily afford a pricey high-end PC, but could stomach 100 yen for a single play. Druaga's early legacy speaks to the fundamentally unique nature of Japanese arcade culture. As a game packed with secrets, some of which were wholly essential to success, Druaga is effectively impossible for a single person to conquer on their own, especially when each attempt costs basically $1. Each of the tower's 60 floors contains a secret that generally helps but occasionally hinders protagonist Gilgamesh in his quest to rescue Princess Kai, who, as was the fashion for princesses in 80s games, has been kidnapped by an 8-armed demon named Druaga. Druaga is seemingly a corruption and a woeful misunderstanding of Durga, the 8-armed Hindu goddess of peace and protection, who of course has nothing to do with mythic Babylonian hero Gilgamesh, but I don't think anyone necessarily played Druaga for a humanities lesson. No, they played to conquer one of the most vexing challenges ever to land in a game center. The players usually weren't alone because their peers were happy to share their own gaming experiences and tips. As Druaga fans figured out the game's secrets and the rules for finding them, which differed on every single floor, they'd leave notes for future players explaining what to do on each level to acquire its treasure. Rather than competing for top scores, they boosted one another, lending a collaborative, communal element to the game that echoed the collective experience explored by primal RPGs, like the game of Dungeons for Plato and the Bones Files of Rogue. While Druaga hooked plenty of players in arcades, it truly came into its own on Famicom. Although it lost its communal aspect when sequestered into homes, the relatively slow-paced and generally complex nature of the game worked best when players could play at their own leisure on their own time without the pressure of dropping 100 yen into the coin slot every time a run went awry, which of course was constantly. The Tower of Druaga casts players in the role of Gil, a knight clad in gold armor that does basically nothing to protect him. His only real defensive measures as he explores come in the form of a sword that he uses to attack enemies by drawing it slowly and brandishing it ahead of himself, and a shield that can block many attacks, but has to be lowered in order for Gil to draw his blade. In other words, you can either attack or defend at any given moment, but not both. Well, that's not entirely true. Gil wields his sword in his right hand, so when he draws his blade, his shield shifts to his left side and can block attacks from that direction. Given how incredibly limited Gil's basic skill set is, even this minor detail factors into combat and becomes an important strategic consideration. Thankfully, Gil's incredibly pitiful skills and arsenal aren't meant to be the end-all and be-all of his combat capabilities. If you play Druaga correctly, his power increases significantly. In the first few floors alone, Gil can find hidden treasures that allow him to break through walls, move permanently at double speed, and hear a musical chime that directs him toward hidden keys. There's also a treasure that grants an extra life, and one that is required to unlock a weapon found toward the end of the game that is essentially mandatory for defeating the final boss. Each of those treasures only appears under specific conditions. These could be as simple as defeating a specific enemy, or walking over the exit door before you've collected the key to unlock it. But before long, you need to perform counterintuitive actions like walking toward a spellcasting mage with your shield raised, pressing the outer wall of the maze, losing a key item, or completing actions in a specific order. The game does nothing to indicate these requirements, of course. You need to figure out everything on your own, or more likely to buy a strategy guide. Video game hint books and strategy guides had already become a booming side business in Japan by this point. While a handful of tip books had become bestsellers in America during the golden age of arcades, the format more or less died off when the US games market crashed. In Japan, however, game-specific books proliferated as the Famicom grew in popularity. Games like Druaga represented a goldmine for guide publishers. With 60 floors of unintuitive but frequently mandatory secrets, it was hardly the sort of thing most players could hope to complete on their own. But armed with a book of tips and spoilers, it became almost manageable. Almost. Even knowing what you're meant to do and how to find all the esoteric goodies hidden throughout the tower, Druaga doesn't pull its punches. Enemies greatly overmatch Gil, as they're capable of firing projectiles and warping around the maze. Mastering Gil's attack powers takes some practice, and even once you've managed that, you need to learn to pass through enemies without either one of you taking damage, as certain treasures will only appear if you cross an enemy without killing it or being killed. Several treasures have to be found and collected, or else players simply won't be able to progress beyond certain points of the game. About a third of the way through the tower, you'll encounter pitch-black rooms that can only realistically be navigated if you've collected a light spell several floors earlier. You can only acquire the requisite Book of Light by opening but not using the exit on the 19th floor. Meanwhile, the 34th floor contains a spell to make exit keys appear on the upper levels. Without it, you literally can't advance beyond the 35th floor. The entire game revolves around this combination of demanding combat and inscrutable yet essential secrets, making it perhaps one of the most difficult games ever to arrive on Famicom. That said, unlike some of the other ridiculously challenging games to have shown up to this point, Druaga isn't hard because it's sloppily programmed or clumsily designed. Everything about the game was built deliberately and with great consideration. It's not fair exactly, but armed with practice and some method of helping to decrypt the more baffling secrets, whether that's advice from a friend or just a strategy guide, Druaga can be mastered. And you can understand why players would have made the effort. In August 1985, the sheer depth and scale of this game exceeded anything else available for any console. Despite its arcade origins, Druaga was the platonic ideal of a console game experience, the sort of thing players could chew on for weeks or even months, steadily making a little more progress each time as they peeled away the layers of mystery one by one through practice, persistence, and patience. I would argue that Druaga was the ultimate bellwether for the changing shape of video games in 1985. It's not simply that consoles had become increasingly popular in mid-80s Japan at the expense of arcades, players were literally being pushed away from arcades. According to Japanese pop culture historian Matt Alt, February of 1985 saw the passage of a new law called the Entertainment and Amusement Trades Control Act, which forbade children under the age of 16 from entering arcades after 6 p.m. A law that remained on the books until its repeal in 2016. A moral panic regulation, the EATCA came into being as a response to the growing popularity of game centers and the concern that kids malingering in arcades would do so at the expense of their studies. The timing of this act couldn't have been better for Nintendo, whose Famicom had already become a hot commodity. Suddenly, kids found themselves deprived of easy access to coin-op games after school hours, so they naturally turned to home consoles. At the same time, console game design had begun to detach itself from traditional arcade design in order to embrace approaches less centered on high scores and twitch skills than on discovery and a sort of persistence that was facilitated by free rather than coin-operated access to a game cart. Druaga established a perfect bridge between the two approaches, being an arcade game with a console mentality. Druaga also has ties to two of the biggest arcade sensations ever to hit Japan. Its designer, Masanobu Endo, had previously designed none other than Xevious. He built Druaga on Super Pac-Man hardware. It's a fantasy role-playing take on the Pac-Man maze chase. With its 60 stages crammed with hazards, monsters, and secrets, Druaga immediately weighed in as one of the most expansive Famicom games on the market, rivaled only by Lode Runner with its 50 stages and Wrecking Crew with its 100. However, its dense design set it apart, and its reliance on hidden secrets and punishing gameplay would be imitated by many other developers in games like Milon's Secret Castle and The Goonies 2. But Druaga never came to the US, and it's probably just as well. In Japan, this game landed at the precise moment in time when it could have had maximum impact. The medium was migrating forcibly away from arcades to consoles, the action RPG was coming into focus as a genre in its own right, and millions of new Famicom owners scrabbled eagerly for a meaty adventure to sink their teeth into. In the US, the non-linear arrival of the NES library, in which Japanese releases from 1983 sat side by side with fresh new releases as late as 1986 or 87, would have made it difficult for Druaga to fit in. But that's okay because we felt Druaga's legacy all the same in games like The Legend of Zelda and Castlevania 2, and in direct sequels like Nightmare of Druaga and Mr. Driller Drillland. The popularity of Druaga on Famicom encouraged other developers to explore that style of game and marry its design philosophy to other genres and styles of games. In the end, it would prove to be one of the most important Famicom releases of all time.
Next time on NES Works Gaiden, The Return of the Robot.